Livestream. Mein Name ist Jan Lidochowski. Ich kandidiere bei der Wiener Gemeinderatswahl am Stadtwahlvorschlag der ÖVP auf Listenplatz 33. Ich danke der Plattform Christdemokratie, dass sie diesen Livestream, dieses Gespräch ermöglicht hat. Bevor ich zu unserem Gast komme, der wirklich außergewöhnlich ist, kurz noch eine Erklärung zu dem, was man da hinter mir sieht. Das ist nämlich die Empfehlung der Plattform Christdemokratie für christliche Kandidaten und ich freue mich sehr, dass ich einer davon bin. Die zweite Kandidatin, die von der Plattform empfohlen wird, ist die Sua Demek, Listenplatz 270. Man kann nämlich 2 Vorzugsstimmen für die Stadt vergeben. Einfach ganz rechts am Wahlzettel das hinschreiben. Ja, weitere Informationen findet man auf www.christdemokratie.at oder auch auf meiner Webseite www.lidochowski.at. Aber jetzt kommen wir zu unserem Gast. Das ist ein ganz außergewöhnlicher Gast. Es ist ein echter britischer Lord, der im House of Lords sitzt. Lord David Alton, wo ich das Vergnügen habe, ihn schon seit 10 Jahren zu kennen, der wirklich unermüdlich sich in England, aber nicht nur in England, sondern auf der ganzen Welt einsetzt. Für die Personen, für die Stummen, die die Stimme nicht erheben können. Es gibt so einen alten Campaign-Slogan von ihm, den habe ich ausgegraben, mit dem ist er angetreten, da heißt so viel, everyone knows someone who was helped by David Alton. Also jeder kennt jemanden, dem von David Alton geholfen wurde. Und das stimmt bis heute so, aber ein bisschen größer als nur sein Wahlkreis, sondern für die ganze Welt stimmt das so. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass er zu dem Gespräch heute zugestimmt hat. Lord David Alton, welcome.
Thank you, Anne. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I was delighted to hear that you're standing as a candidate in the elections.
Thank you, Lord David. So, Lord David, I said some nice words about you, but I would ask you if you could again introduce yourself, how you came into politics, and what's your position now? Because it's for us Central Europeans, it's something peculiar to talk to a real lord in the House of Lords.
I'm always a disappointment when people talk about real lords, because I'm what's called a life peer. I'm not an aristocrat. My father was a demobbed desert rat. He met my mother in the East End of London after the Second World War, and she was from the west of Ireland. Her first language was Irish, not English, and we lived in a very impoverished part of London, and we were rehoused to a public housing estate on the outskirts of London when I was a little boy. And I was fortunate enough to pass a scholarship to go to a school that had been set up by the Jesuits. And later on, I went to Liverpool as a student for my higher education. And it was in my student years that I really became very actively committed to politics, although I joined the Young Liberals whilst I was a student at school. And the events that drew me to politics at that time, I was 17, were the murder of Martin Luther King and the murder of Robert Kennedy, 2 men I had admired as a schoolboy. And I was deeply shocked at what had happened to them and realized politics must be a pretty high calling, and one that if people were willing to give their lives for, should at least take an interest in it. And I started to attend political meetings. The first political meeting I ever went to was a meeting about the common market, as it's called then. And I joined a small political party. It only had 6 members of the House of Commons, running at 3 or 4% in the opinion polls. I didn't join it because I wanted a political career. I believed in the principles that it stood for, which were individual freedoms and liberty, the promotion of justice, human rights, and a passionate belief in subsidiarity. And also it believed in the common market as it then was. So those were reasons why I joined it. But as a student in Liverpool, I found myself living in a neighborhood where half the homes had no inside sanitation, no running hot water, no bathrooms. There were still gaslit streets. The city had suffered cruelly during the Second World War, as many European cities had done. In fact, the decision had been taken on the basis of the need for reconciliation and to twin the city with Cologne, and we faced many challenges that Cologne faced as well in the aftermath of the war. There was still dereliction even when I was a student in the neighborhood where I was living. So I ran for the city council just because I felt that the people who were in power there in the city had done nothing for these most impoverished people. And surprisingly, at 21, as a student, I was elected to the city council. That's where I cut my teeth. And I often call it community politics. It's taught me about the most basic things of all. It was the university of adversity. learning about what made ordinary people's lives. I couldn't believe it when the first week after I was elected, I set up what I called a surgery where people could come with any problems or issues, and there were queues of people, and I thought, good, do they really trust a 20-year-old student to deal with all these things for them? So I learned very rapidly, and I spent 8 years with friends. We campaigned with control of the city of Liverpool. I became a deputy leader, its housing chairman. I was able to do some of the things that needed to be done, practical things for people. And when a parliamentary by-election occurred, I stood in the election. It was no hope seat. I mean, the Liberals hadn't won a seat in Liverpool since 1923. They only had 11 members of the House of Commons, and one of those was on a conspiracy to murder charge. This was not the best of moments to be standing for Parliament. And what's more, the day before the election, the British government collapsed in a vote of no confidence, and Mrs. Thatcher won the vote of confidence, which a general election was called. So I became the shortest lived ever MP. I was elected the day after the government collapsed and the general election was called, and they made my maiden speech within 2 hours of arriving in the House of Commons. Everyone else was packing their bags to go back and fight the general election. But happily, good people of Liverpool re-elected me. I spent 18 years then in the House of Commons before I stood down after differences with my party over conscience questions. And then, much to my surprise, John Major, who was then Prime Minister, put my name forward to the Queen to be appointed as a left peer. So in the House of Lords, where I've been a member since 1997, I don't sit for a political party. I sit as an independent called Crossbenchers, which allows me to make up my mind about issues on their merits.
Do you still consider yourself a liberal?
The word liberal has many connotations. In the American sense, it's often regarded as almost as a swear word. On the continent, it has many associations with anti-clericalism. But in fact, its antecedents in Britain are much different. Mr. Gladstone, one of our, I would argue, probably our greatest non-wartime prime minister, was prime minister 4 times. He was the leader of the Liberal Party. And it was a party that was based on the chapels and the churches of England. I mean, Mr. Gladstone was a deeply religious figure, and he would completely out sympathy with so many of the things that people today who describe themselves as small L liberals would say believe in. Of course, when Churchill was also a big L liberal, he later changed and joined the Conservative Party. But it had an honourable mission, and indeed it produced people even in its wilderness years, like John Maynard Keynes, the economist, Lord Beveridge, who was the founder of our safety net welfare state, and it was a great powerhouse for ideas. But by the time I joined it, I mean, it literally only had 6 MPs in the British House of Commons and a tiny run in the country. So it doesn't exist any longer. It was amalgamated Social Democratic Party. It became a very different party. It called itself the Liberal Democrats, and it fared very, very badly in our most recent general election. And I think that's because it had become too woke. It associates and identifies itself with fringe issues, which I think are relevant to ordinary people. And anyone who dares to oppose what it has to say on politically correct issues like abortion is immediately sidelined, not given the right to speak. And as a former chief whip of the Liberal Party, chairman of its candidates committee, and as a former president of the National League of Young Liberals, I feel very deeply that the removal of the right to conscience of politicians, parliamentarians, is one of the most corrosive things I have seen in politics over the 4 decades I've served here at Westminster.
Could you maybe get more into this topic? So what does it mean? Before you had the right to vote your conscience, is that correct? Or what did really change?
Yes, it is. Under successive Liberal leaders, including the author of the 1967 Abortion Act, who introduced abortion in the UK as a private member's bill, that is a bill that people would vote for according to their consciences, with no party political line. He always respected my right to hold a contrary view to him, which was why we were able to continue respecting one another and to remain friends, why I could serve as his chief whip, which is obviously a position that requires a specific affinity with the leader of a party. But sadly, that all changed. And the party morphed into becoming the Liberal Democrats. They introduced a party policy abortion. And I made it clear that if it became a policy, and this was something that I would no longer be able to say, this is a party you should vote for, because for me, it's the supreme human right, the right to life itself. Even if you don't agree with me about that, even if you say, oh, it's just a matter of choice, what I don't think acceptable is for you to then tell me, but I can't hold the opinion I hold without making it a matter that I have to support as a question of party policy. So I introduced a private member bill challenging the abortion laws, which at the time allowed abortion up to 28 weeks gestation. 28 weeks gestation. Babies are born alive 23 weeks gestation. I sought to reduce the time limits. I won the argument in the House of Commons. All the political leaders voted against me, but the House of Commons voted with me, and I had 296 MPs voted with me by a majority of 45. But our opponents continued to not just oppose the bill, but were so vindictive about anyone daring to challenge the law that they said this will be a matter of party policy. And it was at that point that I said, well, if that is so, then I won't be able to stand again as a Liberal Party candidate. I was very sad about that because there was so much more that I did agree with them about. But subsequently, the hostility to things like church schools, their support for things like euthanasia, I knew that I'd made the right decision, though it saddens me because I still have friends inside the Liberal Democratic Party, and many of them agree with me that the removal of the right to conscience on these questions, one of the reasons why its support in the country is hemorrhaged so much and why it's also so many people who would have otherwise been willing to support them.
But that was a decision just by this party. Do the other parties have this right?
The Conservative Party has maintained a conscience position on abortion, and I salute them for doing that, and I think they are, and I'm glad about it. I mean, there are individual Conservatives who vote for abortion, of course, but that's their conscience position. That's not a problem for me. So long as people are entitled to hold a different point of view, that's what I always urged and asked for. The Labour Party, the left, also has a party policy, and that's why there are so very few people who, for instance, who are Catholic, who are able to stand for the party or speak for it, or the Liberal Democrats for that matter. Similarly, in the United States, why there are so few people now who are able to support the Democrats because of their ardent support for abortion. And in the UK now, the law even allows abortion up to even during birth of a baby with a disability. So 90% of all babies with Down syndrome are routinely aborted. You can abort a baby with a congenital hip displacement, a club foot or a hair lip, right up to and even during birth. Think of the pain that the unborn child is in. And if that doesn't convince you by itself about why these laws should be repealed, think about the discriminatory nature of that law. So in other circumstances, you can abort up to 24-week gestation, but in the case of a disability, to 28 weeks. Now, the same people who argue for that will then argue for ramps on public buildings for wheelchairs because they say it's discriminatory not to provide them. Well, right about the latter, but wrong about the former. There's no consistency there. And similarly, the same people argue for animal rights. They often say that when a fox arrived here at Westminster, holding a placard saying, "Save the human race," we might see the inconsistency and the illogicality of the positions that we're inclined to take.
Well, actually, we have the same situation here in Austria. A disabled child can also be aborted until birth. Most Austrians don't know about that. And that's one of the points where I'm trying to raise awareness that this needs to be changed. It's absurd. It is really absurd. And but is there any political party left in the United Kingdom? Sorry. that stands for the protection of life?
No, none of the mainstream parties do. There are individuals within each of the parties with whom we make common cause. And I'm glad to say that on the issue of euthanasia, assisted suicide, laws like those that apply in Belgium or in Holland or in parts of the United States, in Oregon, now in Canada, sadly, though we have had an extraordinary campaign here against changing the law. And I'm glad to say that in both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, so far we have had majorities against a change of law. So when people say the arguments are all over, that everything can reduce to that ubiquitous slogan, it's my right to choose, putting me, my, I at the heart of the equation, rights, not duties or obligations, choice instead of consequences. When people say it's all reduced to that kind of sloganeering, they're wrong. People really think deeply about this. They have begun to understand the enormity of what happened when some well-meaning people, mainly, I don't suggest that those who introduced the abortion laws were all evil people or something of that kind. I don't say that. I think that they were well-meaning, deeply misguided, and wrong in what they did. Because when you go back and look at the original debates, say things like it will only ever be used in extreme circumstances. There have been 9 million abortions in the United Kingdom since the law was changed. 200,000 every year, 600 each and every single day, or put another way, 1 every 3 minutes. Think about that in the context of 45 minutes that we'll spend talking to one another. And you can see where the argument has gone. And arrogance, which goes with this. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It has its own domestic assembly, which for well-known reasons has not recently been sitting, it is now sitting again. But people at Westminster seized the opportunity in the absence of a functioning assembly, despite every poll showing that people from all sides of the community in Northern Ireland did not want abortion introduced into Northern Ireland. Westminster imposed it anyway. Now, there is data that shows that if looking at numbers of people aborted within Great Britain, if that law had applied in Northern Ireland, there would be 100,000 people dead in Northern Ireland today. People who are alive because abortion wasn't imposed at that time. And do they really believe it's progressive and compassionate and wonderful to now reverse that law against the wishes of people living there? This is arrogant, and it's politically correct. I often say that we don't need PC political correctness. We need PC political courage, and for people to be willing to stand up and be counted, and to speak up for those vulnerable. I'm not anti-women. I'm pro-child. I'm not anti-abortion. I'm pro-life. And I think that we have to set out our stall and say, yes, life begins at conception. It doesn't end at birth. I care passionately about what we do to poorer, impoverished people. I care passionately about what happens to people living in deprived communities. I always have done and always will. I campaign about situations around the world because of human rights violations. But no human right is worth anything if you deny the right to life itself.
You mentioned before political correctness, and I wanted to talk to you about the matter of freedom of speech, because it's my perception that the birthplace of freedom of speech in the United Kingdom and in general the Anglo-Saxon countries seem to have the freedom of speech seems to be in big troubles there. So especially in England, I think you even have a police, where you get to home and arrest you for hate speech. And yeah. So why do you think is this happening in all of places in the United Kingdom?
Well, for what it's worth, Jan, there is a huge backlash against this. People are so angry about the way in which freedom of speech has been oppressed. And I find myself now on, as it were, the same side as people who, in other circumstances, we disagree with one another about substantive issues. But someone like Germaine Greer, who is one of the leading feminists in the United Kingdom, it's outrageous that he cannot be allowed to express her view about transgender issues, even if I disagree with her. But she is not allowed to express that view without suddenly finding herself being rubbished. We've seen the same thing with J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books. But you take a university like perhaps our most celebrated university, University of Oxford, no platforming people because they come to put a pro-life point of view. There's a journalist called Tim Stanley who went to Oxford to debate against someone who had a contrary point of view. They wouldn't allow debate to go ahead because he was offering a pro-life point of view. What are they so frightened of hearing? And I think that does beg a lot of questions in itself. I think they're frightened of hearing the arguments because they know how compelling they are. I'm not frightened of my opponent's argument, but I am fearful when countries try to suppress debate and where they try to clamp down on free speech. And all of us, I think, must be much more trenchant in defending the right of people to express their views, even when you disagree with.
So you are now in the luxurious position of a life peer. You don't have to fight for re-election every few years. You can, talk about whatever you want. You could, you can work for whatever you want. So what are your, what are the main topics you're fighting for now?
I sometimes joke, Jan, that for any non-believers who may be watching this, that the House of Lords proves quite conclusively that there genuinely is life after death, because when I appeared to finish my political life standing down from the House of Commons, kicked off the dust from my shoes like a prisoner for bad behavior, I was dragged back to the penitentiary and given a life sentence. It's an odd existence not to be answerable to the electorate in a general election, but the House of Commons is. And in the end, the House of Commons gets its way on issues. We're here to scrutinise legislation, to offer a second opinion, which they can reject if they don't like it, but we can introduce measures as well, and sometimes they're successful. So during my time in the Lords, I've championed a variety of issues, was able to introduce legislation, for instance, which was successful on assisting people with mesothelioma, which is a terrible lung disorder caused by asbestosis. I've been able to champion many other causes that I care deeply about. Yes, the right to life is one of them, but there are many human rights issues. Only yesterday, I spoke on amendments in the House, one on the position of Roma, 200,000 of whom, of course, died in the Holocaust at the hands of the Nazis. And I was speaking yesterday about discrimination and exclusion of the Roma community, even in a country like this that tries to treat minorities reasonably well. I co-chair the all-parliamentary group on Pakistan minorities, who are treated abysmally. I went to Pakistan myself 2 years ago and have visited some of the slums, so-called colony, in which the Pakistan Christians live. I recently spoke at the launch of a new report on the Ahmadis, who are a persecuted minority because they're not allowed to describe themselves as Muslim inside Pakistan. And this morning I tabled questions about the Uyghur community in Xinjiang, an area I visited in Western China. And I've also been raising the plot of some of those who've been losing their freedoms and liberty in Hong Kong. So these are some of the things I do. I'm a member of the International Relations Select Committee of the House of Lords, and we just published a report that took us, it was the best part of a year to compile on the situation in sub-Saharan Africa. And we've embarked on a new inquiry to Afghanistan. So there are no shortage of issues, no shortage of causes to pursue. But one thing lists them all, and that is my belief that each and every one of us is unique, made in God's image, and therefore not expendable raw material, but to be prized and valued. And therefore, regardless of your gender, regardless of your orientation or your color, regardless of your creed, regardless of your class or your background, you are of unique importance, and God doesn't make mistakes. So each of us, despite our foibles and failings, and plenty of those, each of us are uniquely important to him, and therefore should be important to people who have the privilege of serving in politics. It is a privilege, and you take for granted at your peril. Anyone who has been elected in any capacity or has the right to serve in any legislature should realize that one day they may have to account, not to the electorate, but to the Lord as to how they use the privileges and liberties and freedoms that they were given. Did you speak up for those who were persecuted? Did you speak up for those who were suffering? I mean, I've been involved heavily in the issue of Christian persecution. 250 million people, according to a report published last year by Bishop of Truro, who looked forensically around the world at the request of our Foreign Secretary at the plight of Christians, said that 250 million Christians worldwide are being persecuted. And yet you think, despite what's happening at this moment, the unfolding genocide in Nigeria, despite what is happening in North Korea with 2 million people, it is estimated, persecuted there, with 300,000 people estimated to be in the prison camps in North Korea. Or you think what's happening in China with the Uyghurs, or to the Rohingya Muslims in Burma. You think about the atrocities worldwide and ask the question, why is freedom of religion or belief so low on the agenda of so many secular politicians? It's why people like you, Jan, are so needed and those who are elected in Austria. So I hope that you will make one of your causes the plight of the persecuted and the upholding of minorities.
Do you think that the idea that we are made in the image of God, that this idea is necessary for sustaining our Western civilization with the freedoms we have now?
The three pillars on which our civilization are built are Greek ideas about democracy. Think of Aristotle, who said that we are all part of the community. He said that Adolf Shame would attach to the man who refused to play his part. He said, we aren't solitary pieces in a game of checkers. We're all part of the community, and we must all be political animals, a phrase he uses himself. That is perhaps one pillar. Or think of Roman law, the laws we inherited from the Romans, and the structures, many of the institutions of governance that we have developed and derived over the centuries. And you think about Judeo-Christian ideals, which we inherited from the Christian patriarchs, but also from the prophets of Israel and from the laws and traditions of Israel. These are the things that have blended together to make Judeo-Christian values the cornerstone of who and what we are in Europe. And I think the jettisoning of these values denies us our birthright and undermines our bedrock. I also think it's tragic that these ideas, values are so readily dismissed by institutions now and not being passed on from one generation to the next. I think as a consequence of that, I think that we've got an identity crisis, that we don't know who we are, and we drift along from one challenge to another, and we no longer know what basis those Greek ideals, Roman laws, Judeo-Christian ideas should be informing our response, but they're not. And now we take whatever we can get off the shelf, and we say, oh, well, flavor of the month, put our fingers in the wind, which way are the opinion polls blowing? What should we be saying? These are my principles. If you don't like them, I'll change them. There's no way to govern a society or for us either as human beings to function.
So have you founded the Christian democratic movement in the United Kingdom to do your part in this endeavor?
Well, one of the things that came out of my challenge to the abortion laws in the UK was that I made some unlikely allies in the course of that, people from left, right, and centre. And at the end of it, I wondered, well, is there anything else we can agree about other than wanting to challenge abortion laws? So I brought people together at a place called Prinish Abbey in a Benedictine Abbey in Gloucestershire in England over a very cold, long winter weekend. And it was the Feast of the Epiphany. We called ourselves the Epiphany Group. We knew we had gifts. We knew who we followed, but we didn't know where we were going. And so we thought it'd be worth exploring. And over the following 12 months, we set up a steering group and we developed a declaration called Westminster Declaration. And it contains 6 principles, and they include right to life, but social justice, empowerment, active citizenship, reconciliation, and good stewardship. And we wove those together in political ideas. But we all said that because we came from different backgrounds, nearly 10,000 people joined the movement, but 80% were not members of political parties, 20% were from different backgrounds. We said we wouldn't call ourselves a political party, but we would be a political movement and see if we could influence the political parties and ideas. And although it, like most things, it sort of ran its course, it did actually have quite a significant effect on a number of individuals, some of whom now sit in both houses of parliament. And I always feel that under the surface, Christian democratic ideas are still there trying to inform public and political debate. And yes, in many ways, I would like to see a party, although I wouldn't myself, and this is not a reflection on the decisions of people in Austria or anywhere else, but I wouldn't in Britain certainly be comfortable with the idea of us calling it a Christian party, because, I think we fall a long way short in politics, and bringing the name of Christ into party politics is something I feel uneasy about. But I wrote about it in a book called Faith in Britain, and if any of your viewers suffer from sleepless nights, it has a guaranteed soporific effect, and I can recommend it to them from Amazon.
I would like to get back again to your involvement by helping persecuted Christians all over the world, because I've heard several personal stories. You remember our friend from North Korea and so on. Maybe you could share some stories. So, because we read about numbers, 1 million there, 100,000 there, but those are people with real stories. So maybe if you could share some of them.
Well, I guess it starts really, when a young MP. I didn't come to the House of Commons saying, oh, I'm going to take up the cause of persecuted people, but they have a habit of coming looking for you in a way, because a man came to see me one day. I was a fairly new MP, and he said, I've been asking for, no one seems willing, but will you get involved in helping some Siberian Christians who are in the American embassy in Moscow? This was during the Soviet period. And they had gone looking to try and get exit visas and to get out. And as a consequence, they were spotted by the KGB going there, who surrounded the embassy. And the Siberian Christians were unable to leave. So they spent 3 years in the basement of the American embassy. And so I got involved in this, and Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Pope Paul, all supported the calls for their release. And cut a long story short, they were eventually released. But instead of being able to say, oh, job well done, I started to get letters from people saying that was okay, but what about the following people? I realized that this was far more than anything I could do anything about, but I was shocked by the numbers of people, especially Orthodox Christians, who were incarcerated in the Soviet Union. And there was a man called Alexander Ogorodnikov, whom I became very friendly with and whom I campaigned for. There was a Baptist rock musician called Valery Barov, whom I campaigned for. It led me to go to the Soviet Union during that period with one of my friends, and we managed to see Valery's wife in what was then Leningrad. We visited Jewish refuseniks and dissidents, and I was able to campaign for and get a particular couple out from Moscow. And the first city they came to Israel was my city of Liverpool. We met them in the local synagogue. It was a wonderful moment, and it showed me also the resolve of the Jewish community in supporting Jewish people in the Soviet Union. There was a lesson there for us in the Christian world, and I helped form an organization. It's still going strong, called Jubilee Campaign, which is based in the UK and the United States and the Netherlands, and it works for the freedom of people persecuted because of their religious beliefs. Subsequently, I was on the board of Aid to the Church in Need, which had its antecedents. Its genesis was in Germany, and again, based on that period of the Soviet Union. During that time, I traveled also to the Ukraine, for instance, where we got arrested going into the country. I got released overnight, allowed to go in on a sort of milk train. 1930s rolling stock arrived in Lvov, and I was able to meet that night in a flat in downtown Lvov a man called Evangel, who'd spent 18 years in prison. He was chairman of the committee for the defense of the Greek Catholic Church, and with him that night was Bishop Pavlo Vasilik, who spent 17 years in prayer in the same Soviet prison. They'd, needless to say, become friends. Another occasion, I was able to go to Hungary and into Transylvania, where I met the cardinal who had been imprisoned there for many years. And the Romanians have made the huge error of putting him into the same cell as a man he thought he would be an enemy of because he came from an Orthodox tradition, and Cardinal Todi became his close friend. And it was deeply moving to tell me his own personal stories of the things that he encountered, stories that we forget very easily. On another occasion, I met Ceausescu and raised specifically the case of a man called Georgi Calciu. Father Georgi Calciu is an Orthodox priest who'd had his hands broken so he couldn't make the sign of the cross. And happily, I was able to secure his release. He came en route to the United States. He came via London. We held a celebration of him here in Parliament. And it was deeply moving on the day of the liberation of Romania to see on the national television news Father Calciu in Washington reclaiming the Romanian embassy for the Romanian people. And so stories like that, of course, they're deeply affected over the years. So have the stories of people I met in Egypt after the wall came down. The focus of the Jubilee campaign particularly switched to the Middle East and the Far East, and traveling in countries like Burma and North Korea. I've met extraordinary people, seen terrible situations we've written about. I wrote a book about North Korea, where I tell the story there of the church and the persecution. But, you know, it's not Christian. It's actually a great Australian jurist, lawyer called Mike Kirby, who was commissioned by the United Nations to write a report 3 years ago into human rights violations in North Korea. I gave evidence to that commission of inquiry. And Mr. Justice Kirby, who would tell you himself that, you know, he has absolutely no religious beliefs. He says in that report that what is happening to Christians is singular. And he says that these are the most extreme examples of human rights violations, he said, in the world. He said it is without parallel, his phrase, without parallel anywhere in the world today, and that it brought to mind for him the excesses of the Holocaust. So this isn't exaggeration, it's not made up hysteria, trying to whip up sentiment. What I don't understand is why people who would demonstrate about every other human rights cause in the world, they're on the streets here in London this very day about the so-called Extinction Rebellion. Why isn't there, I care as like them about some of the issues they raise, but why is there nowhere in people's hearts for the persecuted Christians in the world today? I just, the disproportionality of this, I cannot understand.
So maybe the reason is in a rising Christophobia in Europe itself.
I think you put your finger on this, that there is a hatred of Christians, and it often sounds like, well, it serves them right. They had this coming to them for some reason. People, there is a deep-seated hatred, and it's like, I mean, our former chief rabbi Jonathan Sachs, he says himself he cannot understand why people are not out on the street demonstrating about what is happening to Christians. And he says this, he thinks, comes from a deep sense of self-hatred, a deep sense of self-hatred. And I agree with him. I don't understand it, but I detect it and see it. Interestingly, some of the same people who refuse to bat an eyelid about what is being done by Boko Haram, for instance, to northern Nigerians in what is undoubtedly an unfolding genocide, who refuse to even use the word and say, oh, it's all climate change, are most extraordinary, facile arguments. Yes, climate change may contribute to circumstances. Climate change doesn't murder 11 people on Christmas Day. It doesn't go into churches and gun people down. It doesn't take machetes. It doesn't take knives. It doesn't take spears and garrote people, do wicked and terrible things to them. Name things for what they are. No, it's not individual Muslims doing these things. Of course not. In fact, Muslims often suffer as well. But let's name the ideology for what it is. This is an Islamist ideology in these things. And just as I speak out about what's happened to we Muslims or Rohingya Muslims, I'm going to speak out about what happens to Christians as well. And I think all of us need to be a darn sight more consistent about this than we have been hitherto.
And do you see a persecution of Christians in Europe as well? Of course, it's on another level, but do you see the beginning signs, or are you more, not as alarmed as others maybe?
Perhaps I'm not as alarmed as others, but I don't want to use the same word as others. And when I hear them talking about Christians being persecuted in Europe, I don't see that, not in the context of what I see in so many other parts of the world. The freedoms that we do enjoy, people would give their eye teeth for in so many places that I visited over the years. I think of the people I've met in Sudan, for instance, and the wicked, terrible things that have happened to them, or the Eritreans I met recently, 5,000 of whom leave that relatively small country every single month, 5,000 a month, get out of Eritrea, live in those terrible conditions. Why? Because of the persecution of an atheistic regime. It's often called the North Korea of Africa. That is not comparable with the irritations, annoyances, discrimination. I mean, yes, it's discriminatory when two Catholic midwives lose their job in Scotland because they refuse to be complicit in abortions. Yes, it's discriminatory when a Coptic Christian woman working for British Airways is told she can't wear a cross around her neck while she's doing her job. This is just ridiculous. It's discriminatory when people know platformed because they want to offer a traditional point of view about some of the issues we've been discussing. But do I regard that as persecution? No, I don't. And I'm extremely grateful for the privileges, liberties, and freedoms that we enjoy, but I'm always jealously on guard for those same freedoms and liberties. And they're as good as those of us who are defending them. So sometimes we need to be more like the geese that used to make a clang and a noise to wake up the Roman citadel at a time of danger. It was also Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, who was murdered by the Nazis, who said that not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. And I think that's the grave danger for Christians, with a sort of complacency. Well, we can go to church, so why should we bother? They need to speak up and they need to act. And they don't need to say it's because we're being persecuted. They need to say it's because of what Christianity and Judeo-Christian ideals have to offer Europe. And we believe to be right. This is not about right or left, it's about right or wrong. It's what you believe to be right. So why shouldn't you have the opportunity to advance those arguments?
Lord Alton, we're unfortunately coming to an end of our conversation. Time passed.
It could go on forever, I think.
Yeah, yes, it's amazing. But you know, we meet each other regularly since 10 years, but we hardly ever have a chance to talk. It's so busy always. I have one last question.
Of course.
Which I hope is easy for you to answer. If some Austrian Viennese friend would call you and ask for advice for whom to vote, do you have any recommendation?
Well, I tell them to vote for you, for one thing, and also for your colleagues. People like our friend Goodman, whom I know well, I deeply admire. And I think that what you're all trying to do is a good deed in a pretty nasty world. So stick on in there and keep at it. I really hope that when the elections come, that yours will be a successful campaign, but then that you will remember the reasons why you're elected. I've seen so many people climb the ladder and forget why they're there. And they say, oh, well, one day I'll try and change things. And the only thing that changes is themselves. So hold on to what you believe. Don't let politics change you. And do your best for your country, for your people, and those who give you the privilege of voting for you. Thank you for having me on your interview today.
Thank you. Please pray for me. Pray for me that I don't, don't change, or that I bring changement into our system. That's why I'm running for. That's what I'm running for.
Wasn't it St. Augustine who said, pray as if the entire outcome depends upon God, but work as if the entire outcome depends upon you?
Absolutely. That's what I'm trying. Thank you, Lord David. Thank you that you took your time to spend with me those 45 minutes. Ich danke auch den Zuschauern, die heute zugeschaut haben. Oh, Lord David, I got one question here. So,
oh, right.
I knew it. Always when I'm about to finish, I have one question. So I read it to you. Are you aware of the human rights violations happening in Norway, where children are forcibly removed from loving families for no good reasons? Does that happen in the UK as well? There are currently 3 American children separated from their parents in Norway and no help from the US Embassy in Oslo.
I don't know the details of a specific case, and I'm very happy to be given details, and we'll certainly look at it. But does it happen in the United Kingdom? I'm not aware of specific cases where that has happened. I am aware of cases where, for instance, parents have been denied the opportunity to take their own child to other jurisdictions for medical treatment, which have been denied inside our National Health Service. And I've been involved in those cases. There was a very famous case of a little boy called Charlie Gard. And I even went to the United States with his parents because they were so angry that he had been denied the chance to be treated in the US, where might have not been a cure, but certainly a remedy which might have extended Charlie's life. Happily, I'm able to tell you, because it's public as well, Charlie's parents have just another baby, and that baby's been born fine, and there's, in a sense, a happy outcome to that story, but in a way, the bravery of his parents in speaking so strongly about their rights as a couple to take decisions about their own child.
Of course.
That's, to me, really important.
I mean,
and only today I've tabled a question in Parliament about something that's out of the regulations that came into force only yesterday in Britain on coronavirus. It will now be legal, continue to be legal, for 5 people to go to a public house, 5 different people go to a drinking place with a 6th person, and they can spend drinking together. However, if a family with 4 children choose to go together, 6 of them, they will be able to meet the grandparents of their own children, because there will be more than 6 gathered in that family home. I don't think that the government set out to create this crazy anomaly deliberately, but it shows you something about political thinking, that the family and its rights were way down the list, but the rights of people to go to the pub and carry on drinking were high on the list. So I think we have a very distorted view of what really matters. The most basic community of all is the family.
Yeah.
It was a great Austrian, Otto von Habsburg, whom I had the privilege to meet, who, I think probably jokingly, but I'm sure that it was entirely a joke, said to me when I met him in Brussels, he said, what you should do is change the law, and change the law so that from the moment of conception, every child will have a vote to be held by his or her parents until that child comes of age. And I thought, oh, well, that would be what an extraordinary piece of empowerment, and force politicians take notice not only of the child in the womb, but of their families, if such a change was made.
Actually, Viktor Orban tried to introduce this law in Hungary.
Right.
Yes, unfortunately, it was the only part of the new constitution which was refused by the majority of the people.
So it will be up to you to introduce Otto von Habsburg's ideas into the Austrian Parliament.
I will.
I will watch with interest.
With my 4 kids, a small army at home, so we would have many votes. And the situation in Norway is horrific, so I can send you some details. Okay. I think it deserves your attention as well. It is really crazy. So, Lord David, thank you again. I try again to say goodbye. Thank you. You took your time. Thank you to our audience, and I hope to meet you in person soon again, and I also hope to meet my audience in person soon again after this whole crazy Corona crisis is over. Thank you.
Yeah.